A single flame burned in the darkness, small enough to be hidden, powerful enough to change everything. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for being here. Tonight's story focuses on one of the most decisive moments in Greek mythology. The conflict between Prometheus and Zeus, and how the gift of fire permanently altered the balance between gods and humans. In TSBDO, we will follow the story step by step, based on the earliest Greek sources. We will begin with Prometheus' position among the Titans and his role after the fall of Cronus. We will examine how sacrifice established the first boundary between gods and mortals, why Zeus restricted fire in the first place, how Prometheus defied that restriction, and what consequences followed for him, for humanity, and for Zeus' system of rule. This is not a symbolic retelling. It is a literal sequence of decisions, actions, and outcomes. Few stories revealed the limits of Zeus' authority as clearly as this one. Prometheus did not challenge Zeus with armies or rebellion. He challenged him with a single act that could not be undone. Fire did not just provide warmth, it enabled technology, independence, and long-term human development. Once given, it could never be taken back without destroying humanity itself. That raises a critical question that guides this entire narrative. If Zeus ruled the cosmos, why couldn't he simply reverse what Prometheus had done? Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. As the story unfolds, consider this carefully. Was Prometheus punished for defying Zeus or for exposing the limits of divine control? Now let's begin with Act 1, where Prometheus enters the Olympian order, and the first line between gods and humans is drawn. Prometheus occupies a distinct and complex position within Greek mythology. He is a Titan by lineage, born before the Olympian order, yet he is not treated as an enemy after the fall of Cronus. This mattered because survival after the Titanomachy was not granted lightly. Most Titans were bound and cast into Tartarus. Prometheus remained free, active, and influential within Zeus' new system. This survival reflects his function rather than mercy. Prometheus was not associated with brute force or direct rule. He was associated with foresight, planning, and technical intelligence. Qualities Zeus found useful in organizing a stable cosmos. After the defeat of the Titans, Zeus faced a practical challenge. He now ruled gods, subdued primordial forces, and a growing population of humans. Authority alone was not enough. Rules had to be established that defined how humans would relate to the gods and how dependence would be maintained without constant intervention. Prometheus became relevant precisely at this point. Ancient sources place him at the center of early negotiations between divine authority and human survival. This mattered because the boundaries set here would shape every later conflict between Olympus and humanity. The most important of these early interactions involved sacrifice. In the ancient Greek world, sacrifice was not symbolic ornamentation. It was an economic and social mechanism that regulated exchange between humans and gods. Prometheus organized a division of a sacrificial animal into two portions. One portion contained edible meat concealed within an unattractive covering. The other consisted of bones covered in appealing fat. Zeus selected the second portion. This mattered because it fixed the terms of sacrifice permanently. Humans would keep nourishment. The gods would receive ritual honor rather than material sustenance. Zeus immediately recognized the deception. However, he did not reverse the arrangement. This detail matters. By allowing the division to stand, Zeus accepted a limitation on divine consumption while preserving authority through regulation instead of correction. His response came indirectly. Zeus withheld fire from humanity. This mattered because fire was foundational. Without it, humans could not cook meat, refine tools, or develop stable technology. Fire enabled independence. Irreversible. Zeus restricted human advancement while maintaining ritual dominance. This decision illustrates a defining feature of Zeus' governance. He did not punish Prometheus directly at first. Instead, he imposed consequences on the system Prometheus had altered. Humanity became the leverage point. Fire became a regulatory asset, not a gift. This transformed a personal conflict into a structural one. Prometheus' response defines the core conflict of this narrative. He did not negotiate with Zeus or seek compromise. He acted decisively. According to tradition, he stole fire from the gods and concealed it within a hollow plant stalk before delivering it to humans. The exact method varies by source, but the result does not. Fire returned to human society permanently. At this moment, the balance of power changed irreversibly. Zeus could punish Prometheus. He could burden humanity, but he could not remove fire again without destroying the human system he now depended on. Fire enabled sacrifice, labor, and social continuity. Once given, it could not be taken back without collapse. Prometheus' action exposed a limit within Zeus' authority, setting the stage for punishment, not as correction, but as containment. Once fire had been returned to humanity, Zeus' range of options narrowed sharply. The act could not be undone without collapsing the very system he had begun to stabilize. Fire enabled cooking, metallurgy, protection, and organized labor. It also made sacrifice functional, not merely ceremonial. This mattered because Zeus' authority over humans depended on continuity. Removing fire again would not restore control. It would destroy the framework through which control was exercised. Zeus, therefore, shifted strategy. Instead of attempting reversal, he focused on consequence. Prometheus had exposed a structural limit in divine governance, and that exposure had to be addressed without destabilizing the system. Punishment became the only viable response. Importantly, this punishment was not designed to correct Prometheus' behavior. Fire could not be taken back. The purpose was deterrence. Zeus needed to demonstrate that challenging divine boundaries carried lasting cost, even when the challenge succeeded. According to Hesiod, Prometheus was bound and subjected to a continuous torment. An eagle fed daily on his liver, which regenerated each night. This mattered because the punishment was neither swift nor terminal. Zeus chose endurance over execution. Prometheus would remain alive as a permanent example. The form of punishment reinforced the message. Foresight had been used to undermine authority. Now Prometheus would experience consequences he could foresee, but not avoid. At the same time, Zeus imposed a second response, directed at humanity, rather than Prometheus himself. This response was not framed as direct violence, but as structural limitation. Zeus ordered the creation of Pandora. She was fashioned collaboratively by the Olympian gods and presented as a gift to humans. This mattered because the punishment was indirect. Zeus did not attack human settlements or withdraw fire again. He altered human conditions from within. Pandora carried a sealed container that, once opened, released afflictions into human life. Disease, hardship, labor, and suffering became permanent features of the human condition. This mattered because the cost of fire was now distributed across all future generations. Humans gained independence and technological potential, but they also inherited vulnerability. The balance between benefit and burden was recalibrated. Importantly, hope remained inside the container. Ancient sources differ on interpretation, but the structural role is clear. Hope prevented collapse. Without it, humans would not endure. This mattered because Zeus did not aim to erase humanity. He aimed to regulate it. Suffering limited ambition. Hope sustained compliance. Together, they stabilized the system. Through these actions, Zeus reasserted authority without reversing Prometheus' success. Prometheus remained punished. Humanity remained burdened. Fire remained in human hands. This outcome reveals the core limitation of Zeus' power. He could enforce consequence, but he could not undo structural change once it had propagated. Prometheus' act, therefore, marked a turning point. It demonstrated that foresight and technical knowledge could permanently alter the balance between gods and mortals. Zeus adapted rather than collapsed. He preserved order by absorbing the disruption rather than eliminating it. This adaptation would become a defining feature of Olympian governance. By the end of this phase, the relationship between gods and humans had been permanently redefined. Humanity was no longer fully dependent. The gods were no longer fully in control. Authority persisted, but with constraints. The next act examines how this altered balance shaped the long-term position of humans within the Olympian system and why. Prometheus' defiance continued to matter long after his punishment was set in place, and with fire permanently in human hands, the relationship between mortals and the Olympian order entered a new phase. This mattered because fire did not simply improve daily survival. It altered the trajectory of human development in ways the gods could not fully predict or reverse. Cooking increased nutrition and longevity. Metalworking enabled tools and weapons. Firelight extended activity beyond daylight hours. Each of these changes reduced human dependence on direct divine intervention. Zeus understood these implications immediately. Fire transformed humans from passive recipients of divine allowance into active agents, capable of shaping their environment. This mattered because Olympian authority relied on asymmetry. The gods ruled because they controlled access to essential resources. Fire weakened that control. Humans could now solve problems without appealing to Olympus at every step. However, this shift did not create equality. Fire empowered humans, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Settlements attracted conflict. Tools enabled warfare. Technology increased expectations that could not always be met. This mattered because progress carried cost. Zeus' system absorbed these costs rather than preventing them, allowing human advancement to proceed within limits defined by suffering and mortality. Prometheus' role in this transformation was indirect, but decisive. He did not guide human civilization beyond the act of theft. Once fire was delivered, its consequences unfolded independently. This mattered because it removed Prometheus from ongoing control. His punishment isolated him from the world he had altered, reinforcing Zeus' preference for containment over correction. At the societal level, fire enabled humans to establish more permanent communities. Agriculture became more reliable. Craft specialization emerged. Trade expanded. This mattered because complexity increased. More complex societies generated disputes, hierarchies, and inequality. Divine oversight became more difficult as human systems developed internal momentum. Zeus responded to this complexity by refining the boundaries of divine involvement. Rather than intervening constantly, the gods influenced outcomes selectively. Oracles, omens, and patronage replaced direct governance. This mattered because it preserved authority while reducing administrative burden. Humans were guided, not managed. At the same time, Zeus reinforced the cost structure introduced with Pandora. Labor became unavoidable. Suffering accompanied innovation. This mattered because it prevented unchecked growth. Fire empowered humanity, but hardship restrained ambition. The system balanced advancement with limitation. The introduction of fire also reshaped moral frameworks. Humans became responsible for the consequences of their creations. Weapons enabled defense, but also violence. Tools improved survival, but intensified competition. This mattered because accountability shifted downward. Humans could no longer attribute every outcome to divine whim. Some responsibility became theirs. By the end of this stage, humanity occupied a new position within the Olympian order. Humans were still subject to divine authority, but they were no longer fully dependent. Fire created a buffer between mortal survival and divine permission. Zeus adapted by governing outcomes rather than processes. This adaptation preserved the Olympian system, but it also set a precedent. Once a fundamental tool escaped divine control, future challenges would not be limited to rebellion or force. They would involve irreversible change. The next part examines how this precedent shaped Zeus's long-term approach to human autonomy and Why Prometheus Act continued to define the limits of divine power long after his punishment was established. As human societies adapted to life with fire, Zeus' governance shifted from direct restriction to indirect regulation. This mattered because the removal of fire had failed as a control mechanism, and its restoration could not be reversed. Zeus therefore focused on shaping the consequences of human advancement, rather than attempting to halt it. Authority was preserved by managing outcomes, not by denying tools. One immediate consequence of fire was specialization. Humans no longer needed to devote all effort to survival. Some became metalworkers, others builders, others organizers of labor. This mattered because specialization created dependency within human communities. Hierarchies emerged. Leadership became necessary. With hierarchy came conflict. Zeus did not intervene to prevent this. He allowed social friction to develop because it limited unity and reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance against divine authority. Fire also transformed warfare. Weapons could now be forged with greater durability and lethality. This mattered because violence scaled. Conflicts that might once have been brief became prolonged and destructive. From Zeus' perspective, this carried risk, but also advantage. Human populations that expend energy in conflict are less capable of collective defiance. The system tolerated violence as long as it did not threaten cosmic stability. Religious practice adapted alongside technology. Fire made sacrifice more efficient and more frequent. Burnt offerings became central to ritual life. This mattered because sacrifice reinforced dependence, even as technology reduced it. Humans could build and fight independently, but they still sought favor, protection, and meaning from the gods. Zeus' authority persisted through ritual rather than necessity. Prometheus' absence during this phase is significant. Bound and punished, he could not guide or correct the trajectory he had set in motion. This mattered because human development proceeded without oversight from its original benefactor. Fire empowered humanity, but it did not provide wisdom. Zeus's punishment ensured that knowledge and foresight remained fragmented rather than centralized. At the same time, Zeus monitored human ambition through selective intervention. Myths preserve examples of mortals punished for overreach, those who challenged divine boundaries directly. This mattered because Zeus distinguished between growth and defiance. Innovation was tolerated. Hubris was not. The boundary between the two was intentionally ambiguous, reinforcing caution. The introduction of suffering through Pandora continued to shape this phase. Labor intensified as societies expanded. Disease spread more easily in dense settlements. Mortality remained unavoidable. This mattered because it counterbalanced technological progress. Fire made life more capable, but not safer. The cost of advancement was paid continuously. By this point, a pattern was clear. Zeus' rule adapted to irreversible change by embedding limits into human experience, rather than withdrawing resources. Fire had escaped divine monopoly. Zeus responded by monopolizing consequence. Humans could act freely, but outcomes remained constrained by suffering, mortality, and fate. This adaptation stabilized the Olympian system without restoring its former dominance. Authority persisted, but it operated through structure rather than control. Prometheus' Act had forced a permanent adjustment in governance. The next part examines how this adjustment influenced Zeus' long-term view of human autonomy and how the precedent of irreversible change shaped divine responses to later challenges. As the consequences of fire spread across human society, Zeus was forced to confront a deeper implication of Prometheus' Act. Some forms of change could not be governed through punishment alone. This mattered because punishment works only when reversal remains possible. Fire had crossed that threshold. Humanity had internalized it, and its effects multiplied beyond any single decision or decree. Zeus' response during this phase reveals a strategic recalibration rather than loss of control. Instead of attempting to reclaim what was lost, he reinforced the distinction between permission and consequence. Humans were no longer prevented from acting, but they were increasingly held responsible for outcomes. This mattered because responsibility functioned as a stabilizer. When suffering followed action, ambition moderated itself. One of the clearest examples of this approach appears in the way myths begin to emphasize human error rather than divine denial. Disasters are attributed to poor judgment, arrogance, or miscalculation. This mattered because it shifted narrative causality downward. Zeus did not need to intervene to limit every excess. Human systems generated their own failures. Fire accelerated this process by amplifying scale. A mistake made with primitive tools affected a household. A mistake made with metal weapons or large infrastructure affected entire communities. This mattered because self-correction became brutal but effective. Societies that expanded too quickly often collapsed under their own weight. Zeus' governance absorbed these collapses without destabilization. At the same time, Zeus refined mechanisms of indirect oversight. Oracles, signs, and omens gained prominence. These did not prevent action, but they framed it. This mattered because interpretation replaced command. Humans were warned rather than restrained. Failure could be attributed to misunderstanding rather than injustice. Prometheus' punishment continued unchanged during this phase, and its visibility mattered. His ongoing suffering served as a fixed reference point within the system. He had succeeded in altering the human condition, but he paid an unending cost. This mattered because it reinforced a central rule. Success does not negate consequence. The system allowed irreversible change, but it did not forgive the act that caused it. Zeus also avoided turning Prometheus into a martyr. Execution would have closed the story. Endurance kept it open. This mattered because the lesson remained active rather than historical. As long as Prometheus suffered, the boundary he crossed remained relevant. Human culture absorbed this lesson unevenly. Some traditions treated Prometheus as a benefactor. Others emphasized his punishment. This mattered because ambiguity preserved authority. A clear moral verdict might have encouraged imitation. Ambiguity discouraged it. By the end of this stage, Zeus had effectively reasserted dominance without reclaiming control. The Olympian system no longer relied on monopolizing tools. It relied on structuring consequence, interpretation, and endurance. Fire had changed humanity permanently, but it had also clarified the limits of rebellion. Irreversible change was possible. Freedom from consequence was not. This balance allowed Zeus' rule to persist without collapse. However, it also set a precedent that would resurface repeatedly. If one titan could permanently alter the human condition through a single act, others might attempt similar disruptions. The next part examines how Zeus prepared for that possibility and how Prometheus' act reshaped divine tolerance for future challenges. BT's point, Zeus' response to Prometheus' act had matured into a clear governing doctrine. Irreversible change would not be undone. Instead, it would be absorbed, regulated, and surrounded by consequences. A discouraged repetition. This mattered because it defined the limits of tolerance within the Olympian system. Innovation could occur. Structural defiance could not occur without cost. Zeus' handling of fire became a reference model for later divine decisions. When a boundary was crossed in a way that permanently altered the human condition, Zeus no longer attempted restoration. He focused on containment and signaling. Prometheus' punishment remained visible and unending, while humanity continued to live with both the benefits and burdens of fire. This dual outcome mattered because it communicated two messages simultaneously. Progress was possible, but authority still imposed limits. At the divine level, Prometheus' act increased caution. Zeus became more selective about allowing titans or lesser divine figures access to mechanisms that could produce irreversible effects. This mattered because power was no longer defined only by strength or lineage, but by control over transformative tools. Knowledge itself became a regulated domain. The Olympian order adjusted accordingly. Hephaestus' role as divine craftsman gained importance. Athena's association with strategy and skill became more prominent. These shifts mattered because they centralized transformative knowledge within the Olympian hierarchy, rather than allowing it to circulate freely. Prometheus' foresight had demonstrated how dangerous decentralized knowledge could be. For humanity, the long-term effect of fire continued to unfold independently of divine intent. Population growth accelerated. Environmental pressures increased. Competition intensified. This mattered because human problems increasingly originated from human systems rather than divine punishment. Zeus's authority remained intact precisely because he was no longer blamed for every failure. Responsibility diffused downward. At the same time, ritual dependence persisted. Despite technological independence, humans continued to seek divine favor. Fire enabled sacrifice, but sacrifice reinforced hierarchy. This mattered because it preserved a psychological and cultural link between mortals and gods, even as material dependence weakened. Prometheus' ongoing punishment ensured that his act was never framed as a clean victory. Humans gained fire, but the benefactors suffered endlessly. This mattered because it prevented a simple narrative of liberation. The system allowed improvement without endorsing rebellion. That balance preserved stability. By the end of this act, a new equilibrium had formed. Humans possessed a foundational tool that enabled civilization. Zeus retained authority by regulating consequence rather than access. Prometheus remained bound as a permanent reminder of the cost of structural defiance. No party achieved total victory, but the system endured. This outcome marked a decisive turning point. The conflict between Prometheus and Zeus did not end with resolution. It ended with adjustment. The Olympian order proved capable of absorbing irreversible change without collapsing, but only by narrowing tolerance for future disruption. The next act examines how this precedent shaped later interactions between gods and humans, especially moments when knowledge, ambition, or innovation once again threatened to exceed the limits Zeus had established after the theft of fire. After the precedent established by Prometheus, Zeus began to treat knowledge itself as a potential source of instability. This mattered because fire was not dangerous merely as a tool. It was dangerous as a multiplier. Once humans learned to control a foundational element, every other form of technical and strategic knowledge gained leverage. Zeus' authority could tolerate strength, numbers, and even limited rebellion. What it could not tolerate was uncontrolled access to transformative understanding. In earlier phases of myth, divine power was associated primarily with force and lineage. After Prometheus, it became increasingly associated with information and access. This mattered because the Olympian order began to centralize knowledge within its own hierarchy. Skills that could alter human capacity at scale were no longer allowed to circulate freely. They were embedded in specific deities whose loyalty and role were already secured. Athena's prominence during this period reflects this shift. She was associated with strategy, craftsmanship, and practical intelligence, but always within structured limits. Athena taught human skills that improved society architecture, weaving, governance, but not without restraint. This mattered because her guidance reinforced order rather than independence. Knowledge was framed as civic, not liberating. Hephaestus occupied a similar position as the divine craftsman. He possessed unparalleled technical ability, yet his work remained under Olympian oversight. Weapons forged by Hephaestus served gods and chosen heroes, not humanity at large. This mattered because control over production limited dissemination. Innovation existed, but it was gated. Zeus' governance strategy during this phase focused on compartmentalization. Different domains of knowledge were isolated, assigned, and monitored. No single figure besides Zeus himself possessed comprehensive access. This mattered because Prometheus had combined foresight with execution. Preventing that combination reduced the risk of systemic disruption. For humanity, this meant that progress continued, but unevenly. Some cities advanced rapidly through divine patronage. Others stagnated. This mattered because uneven development discouraged unified advancement. Competition replaced coordination. Human societies grew complex, but fragmented. Prometheus' continued punishment reinforced these boundaries. His foresight remained intact, but his ability to act was removed. This mattered because Zeus targeted agency rather than awareness. Knowledge without agency posed no immediate threat. Action, death. By separating the two, Zeus neutralized the risk without erasing the lesson. The system also relied increasingly on secrecy. Divine knowledge was often concealed, revealed only through riddles, omens, or intermediaries. This mattered because obscurity reduced misuse. Humans received guidance, but not instruction manuals. Interpretation replaced replication. By the end of this stage, the Olympian order had effectively redrawn the line Prometheus crossed. Fire had escaped control. Knowledge would not. Authority adapted by narrowing access rather than increasing punishment. This approach preserved stability while allowing limited advancement. The next part examines how this strategy played out in practice, particularly in moments when humans or lesser divine figures once again approached forbidden knowledge, and how Zeus enforced boundaries without repeating the mistakes revealed by Prometheus' defiance. As Zeus refined control over knowledge, enforcement shifted from dramatic punishment to quiet prevention. This mattered because prevention reduces risk without drawing attention to limits. After Prometheus, Zeus avoided creating new examples as vivid as an eternally tortured Titan. Instead, he built a system where access itself determined outcome. Those who never received transformative knowledge could never misuse it. One method of prevention was selective patronage. Gods granted skills to specific individuals rather than to humanity as a whole. Kings received counsel through dreams. Craftsmen received partial inspiration. Heroes were taught techniques suited to singular tasks. This mattered because knowledge became situational rather than transferable. A method that worked once could not be easily replicated without renewed divine favor. Prophecy played a complementary role. Oracles disclosed outcomes without revealing mechanisms. This mattered because knowing what would happen did not explain how to make it happen. Prophecy satisfied curiosity while preserving control. Humans could prepare emotionally, but not engineer results. Zeus allowed disclosure without instruction. Another control mechanism was consequence through proximity. Those who approached forbidden knowledge often suffered indirectly rather than being struck down immediately. Curiosity led to exposure. Exposure led to error. Error produced loss. This mattered because punishment appeared organic rather than imposed. The system taught limits without overt enforcement. Myths preserve multiple instances where mortals or lesser figures attempted to exceed assigned roles. In these accounts, failure rarely came from ignorance. It came from miscalculation. This mattered because it reinforced the idea that intelligence alone was insufficient. Wisdom required restraint, and restraint required acceptance of boundary. Zeus' system favored those who knew when to stop. Prometheus' continued visibility remained important in this context. His punishment did not escalate, but it did not end. This mattered because permanence reinforces memory. Prometheus' suffering became a fixed landmark within the moral landscape of myth. Anyone seeking to cross similar boundaries did so with a known reference point. The cost was not theoretical, it was ongoing. At the divine level, Zeus also discouraged collaboration that could recreate Prometheus' combination of foresight and execution. Alliances were monitored. Roles were reinforced. This mattered because systemic disruption rarely arises from a single capacity. It arises from convergence. Zeus prevented convergence by keeping domains separate. For humanity, this structure produced mixed outcomes. Innovation occurred, but slowly. Progress advanced in pockets rather than waves. This mattered because it preserved diversity but limited acceleration. Civilizations rose and fell independently. No unified human system emerged that could rival divine authority. At the same time, Dependence shifted from material to interpretive. Humans relied on gods not for tools, but for meaning. Ritual, myth, and tradition became primary interfaces. This mattered because it redirected ambition inward. Seeking favor replaced seeking mastery. By the end of this phase, Zeus had transformed the lesson of Prometheus into policy. Knowledge could exist, foresight could exist, but the capacity to combine them into irreversible action was tightly constrained. Authority no longer needed to react dramatically. It operated quietly through structure. The next part examines the pressure this system created over time, how suppressed ambition does not disappear, but accumulates, and how Zeus managed that pressure without reopening the possibility of another Prometheus-like disruption. As Zeus' system of restricted knowledge remained in place over generations, a secondary effect began to emerge. Suppressed ambition did not disappear. It accumulated. This mattered because accumulation creates pressure, and pressure seeks release. While the Olympian order prevented large-scale disruptions, it could not eliminate curiosity, dissatisfaction, or the desire to exceed assigned limits. Instead, those impulses were redirected into narrower channels. One of these channels was heroic exception. Rather than granting broad access to transformative knowledge, Zeus permitted individual figures to operate near boundaries under strict conditions. Heroes were allowed to perform extraordinary feats, but only within defined narratives and finite lifespans. This mattered because heroes acted as pressure valves. They demonstrated possibility without enabling replication. Once a hero died, the threat ended. This structure also ensured that success carried personal cost. Heroes often suffered loss, exile, or premature death. This mattered because achievement was framed as exceptional rather than sustainable. The system allowed peaks but prevented plateaus. Human potential could spike, but it could not stabilize at a higher level that threatened divine hierarchy. Another channel for accumulated pressure was mythic warning. Stories circulated of figures who reached too far and failed. These narratives functioned as boundary reinforcement. This mattered because instruction through example is more durable than decree. Zeus' system increasingly relied on memory rather than enforcement. The past became a regulatory tool. At the societal level, ambition expressed itself through competition rather than coordination. Cities vied for favor. Kings sought prestige through lineage and ritual. This mattered because competition fragmented effort. Unified advancement was replaced by rivalry. The Olympian order benefited from this fragmentation, as no single human system gained irreversible advantage. Zeus also allowed limited experimentation within safe parameters. Agricultural improvements, civic organization, and art flourished. This mattered because it prevented stagnation without risking disruption. Progress that did not alter power balance was tolerated. Progress that did was constrained. Prometheus' punishment continued to serve as a silent boundary marker throughout this period. Its constancy mattered more than its cruelty. The punishment did not escalate because escalation was unnecessary. The lesson had already been absorbed into the system. Prometheus became less a rebel and more a reference point. Over time, the memory of Prometheus shifted. Some traditions emphasized his benefit, others emphasized his suffering. This mattered because ambiguity reduced imitation. Clear heroes inspire repetition. Ambiguous figures provoke caution. Zeus' system favored caution. By managing pressure through exception, fragmentation, and memory, Zeus prevented the emergence of another irreversible act. No second theft of fire occurred. No comparable breach followed. The system adapted successfully. However, this success introduced a long-term cost. When ambition has no constructive outlet, it does not vanish. It turns inward. Human culture increasingly focused on interpretation, endurance, and explanation rather than transformation. Fate, rather than innovation, became the dominant narrative framework. This shift stabilized the Olympian order, but narrowed the horizon of possibility. The world continued it, but it did not fundamentally change. The final part of this act examines whether this outcome represents effective governance or managed limitation, and how Prometheus' defiance ultimately reshaped not just what humans could do, but what they believed was possible. By the end of this phase, Zeus' approach to governing knowledge had produced a stable but constrained system. Transformative understanding was no longer absent from the world, but it was segmented, delayed, and individualized. This mattered because stability was achieved not by suppressing intelligence, but by preventing its consolidation. Prometheus had succeeded because he combined foresight with execution and delivered the result universally. Zeus's response ensured that such combinations would not occur again at scale. The effectiveness of this strategy is evident in what does not happen. No second act comparable to the theft of fire appears in Greek myth. There is no later figure who permanently elevates humanity's baseline capacity in a single, irreversible step. This mattered because it shows that Zeus' policies worked as intended. The system absorbed the shock of Prometheus' act, and then closed the pathway that made it possible. At the same time, the costs of this closure became increasingly visible. Human development continued, but it followed a narrow corridor. Skills improved incrementally, societies advanced unevenly. Catastrophic collapse remained common, while structural breakthrough did not. This mattered because the system traded explosive risk for chronic limitation. Humanity could grow, but not escape its fundamental constraints. Zeus' authority benefited directly from this outcome. By positioning knowledge as conditional rather than universal, he maintained hierarchy without constant intervention. Power no longer needed to react aggressively. It operated through design. This mattered because design systems outlast enforced ones. Zeus ruled longer than any predecessor precisely because he governed potential, not just action. Prometheus' punishment remained unchanged, and its symbolic role evolved. It was no longer primarily a warning against rebellion. It became a marker of transition. Before Prometheus, authority was based on control of resources. After Prometheus, it was based on control of access. This mattered because it redefined what power meant in the Olympian order. For humanity, the lesson was subtle but enduring. Advancement was possible, but only within bounds that could not be collectively challenged. Individual brilliance might be rewarded. Collective transformation would not be tolerated. This mattered because it shaped cultural expectation. People learned to seek favor, not autonomy. Explanation, not mastery. Zeus no longer needed to demonstrate power overtly. The absence of further irreversible disruptions functioned as proof of control. Authority became invisible because it was effective. The system no longer produced dramatic confrontations because it prevented the conditions that produced them. This outcome set the conditions for the next development in the narrative, with knowledge regulated and ambition contained. The relationship between gods and humans shifted again. The question was no longer what humans could learn or build, but how they would live under limits they could not cross. The next act examines how this constrained environment shaped morality, responsibility, and the long-term psychological landscape of human existence under Olympian rule, with knowledge constrained and irreversible change prevented. The Olympian system entered a phase defined less by innovation and more by adaptation. This mattered because humans were now fully aware through myth, ritual, and precedent that certain boundaries could not be crossed without permanent costs. Prometheus' fate had clarified the outer edge of possibility. What followed was not rebellion, but adjustment to a fixed horizon. Human societies responded to these limits by reorganizing values. Achievement became local, rather than universal. Cities sought stability instead of expansion beyond control. Kings emphasized continuity of lineage, ritual correctness, and favor from the gods. This mattered because authority within human systems began to mirror Olympian authority. Rule was justified by preservation rather than progress. Moral frameworks evolved accordingly. Earlier myths often frame morality as obedience rewarded or punished directly by gods. Under this constrained system, morality became internalized. Humans were expected to act within limits regardless of outcome. This mattered because right action no longer guaranteed success. It guaranteed survival within the system. Tragedy emerges here not as chaos, but as consequence within a stable order. Zeus' role during this phase was largely supervisory. He intervened selectively when boundaries were challenged, but he did not manage daily affairs. This mattered because authority functioned through expectation rather than enforcement. When limits are widely understood, enforcement becomes rare. The system polices itself through shared understanding. Ritual practice became more central as direct access to transformative power declined. Sacrifice, prayer, and festivals structured time and behavior. This mattered because ritual reinforced hierarchy while providing psychological stability. Humans could not change the structure of the world, but they could locate themselves within it. Ritual replaced transformation with meaning. The gods reinforced this arrangement by rewarding moderation and punishing excess unpredictably. This mattered because unpredictability discouraged testing limits. When punishment is consistent, it can be calculated. When it is selective, it produces caution. Zeus' system favored caution. Prometheus' punishment continued unchanged, and its endurance mattered more than its intensity. It served as a permanent background condition rather than an active deterrent. Over time, Prometheus became less a rebel and more a symbol of boundary itself. This mattered because symbols regulate behavior more effectively than threats. Human ambition did not vanish. It narrowed. Creativity expressed itself in art, storytelling, and interpretation rather than structural change. This mattered because culture flourished even as power stagnated. Humans became skilled at meaning-making within constraint. By the end of this stage, the Olympian system had produced a world that was coherent, durable, and limited. The chaos of earlier ages was gone. In its place was a structured existence defined by known boundaries and manageable suffering. The next part examines the long-term consequences of this arrangement, how living under fixed limits shaped not only behavior, but identity, belief, and the way humans understood their place in a universe ruled by distant but enduring gods. As human communities adjusted to fixed boundaries, identity began to form around endurance rather than expansion. This mattered because survival within limits requires different virtues than growth without constraint. Strength became measured not by conquest, but by the ability to persist through hardship, uncertainty, and loss. Greek myth reflects this shift by emphasizing resilience, loyalty to tradition, and acceptance of fate as defining human qualities. Religious belief adapted to support this identity. Gods were no longer approached primarily as sources of transformation, but as guarantors of order. This mattered because worship became less transactional and more stabilizing. Rituals did not promise change. They promised continuity. Humans prayed not to alter destiny, but to endure it with dignity. Zeus' authority benefited from this transformation. When expectations narrowed, disappointment diminished. This mattered because systems fail when promises exceed capacity. The Olympian order promised structure, not salvation. By aligning belief with that promise, Zeus reduced friction between divine authority and human experience. Social institutions mirrored this alignment. Law codes emphasized precedent. Customs were preserved rather than revised. This mattered because predictability reduces conflict. When rules remain stable, behavior adapts. Zeus' system did not require perfect justice. It required consistency. Tragedy became the dominant narrative form of this age. Heroes acted correctly and still suffered. This mattered because tragedy taught limits more effectively than doctrine. Audiences learned that effort does not guarantee outcome. Acceptance, not victory, became the measure of wisdom. This narrative reinforced Olympian stability without direct intervention. Prometheus' story continued to circulate within this cultural framework. Its interpretation shifted again. He was no longer primarily admired for his defiance or condemned for his punishment. He was remembered as the point where limits became clear. This mattered because clarity discourages repetition. Prometheus acted to find the boundaries so fully that no comparable act was attempted. Zeus' restraint during this period is notable. He did not seek further confrontation. This mattered because power that no longer needs to prove itself becomes self-sustaining. The absence of dramatic divine action reinforced the perception that the system was settled. Human creativity adapted accordingly. Art, poetry, and philosophy explored meaning rather than escape. This mattered because imagination flourishes even under constraint, but it turns inward. The Olympian order limited what humans could do, not what they could think. Thought became a refuge. Over generations, this inward turn reshaped human self-understanding. Mortals no longer measured themselves against gods. They measured themselves against circumstance. This mattered because ambition shifted scale. The question became not how to transcend the world, but how to live well within it. By the end of this phase, the Olympian system had achieved deep cultural integration. Its limits were no longer enforced externally. They were internalized. Humans lived within boundaries. They did not challenge because those boundaries had become part of identity itself. The next part examines the cost of this internalization. How acceptance can stabilize a system while quietly eroding the capacity to imagine alternatives, and how that erosion ultimately affected the relationship between humans, gods, and the concept of meaning itself. As limits became internalized, a subtle transformation occurred in how humans understood responsibility. Earlier phases of myth emphasized divine causation. Gods acted, humans reacted. Under the stabilized Olympian order, responsibility shifted inward. This mattered because accountability no longer depended on direct divine command. Humans were expected to govern themselves within known boundaries, even when outcomes remained beyond control. Law and custom absorbed this expectation. Justice was framed less as divine retribution and more as social maintenance. This mattered because communities learned to regulate behavior without appealing to Olympus. For every conflict, Zeus's authority was preserved precisely because it was not invoked constantly. Distance reinforced legitimacy. At the same time, explanation replaced expectation. When disaster struck, mortals increasingly turned to interpretation rather than accusation. Oracles were consulted to understand meaning, not to prevent outcome. This mattered because it reduced confrontation. Fate provided coherence where justice could not. The system favored understanding over resistance. This interpretive posture reshaped the role of wisdom. Wisdom no longer meant discovering how to change the world. It meant knowing how to act when change was impossible. This mattered because it aligned human aspiration with systemic constraint. Philosophy, ethics, and reflection flourished where engineering of fate could not. Prometheus' legacy functioned within this shift. His act was remembered not as a path to liberation, but as an anomaly that clarified the rules. This mattered because anomalies teach boundaries. Prometheus showed what happens when foresight becomes action without permission. The lesson endured precisely because it was singular. Zeus' system benefited from this singularity. Without repetition, defiance lost momentum. There was no movement, no school, no lineage of Promethean challengers. This mattered because systems collapse when challenges become collective. Individual exceptions can be contained. Collective transformation cannot. Human ambition therefore expressed itself in bounded forms. Reputation, honor, and legacy became central concerns. This mattered because these goals are finite. They do not threaten cosmic structure. A hero may be remembered, but memory does not alter reality. Zeus' order tolerated legacy because it ended with death. Mortality itself reinforced limits. Fire had extended life and capability, but not indefinitely. Death closed every human story. This mattered because it capped accumulation. Knowledge, wealth, and power did not persist beyond a generation. The Olympian system relied on this reset to prevent escalation. By the end of this stage, The relationship between gods and humans had reached equilibrium. Humans no longer expected transformation. Gods no longer needed to impose it. The system functioned because expectations aligned with capacity. However, equilibrium carries its own cost. When limits are fully accepted, imagination narrows, possibility contracts. Meaning becomes maintenance rather than discovery. This mattered because a world that endures without evolving risks becoming. The final part of this act examines that cost directly how internalized limits preserved order while quietly diminishing the human sense of potential, and how that trade-off defined the lasting psychological legacy of Prometheus' defiance under Zeus' rule. As internalized limits became the default condition of human life, the Olympian system achieved its most stable form. Order no longer depended on constant divine action or visible punishment. It depended on expectation. Humans anticipated boundaries and adjusted behavior accordingly. This mattered because expectation is more durable than enforcement. Once limits are assumed, authority no longer needs to assert itself loudly. This stability reshaped how suffering was interpreted. Hardship was no longer framed primarily as divine anger or correction. It was understood as a feature of existence within a bounded system. This mattered because it reduced confrontation with the gods. When suffering is structural rather than personal, blame dissipate. Zeus' authority benefited from this diffusion of responsibility. Prometheus' story, at this stage, functioned less as warning and more as explanation. It explained why the world contained both capability and constraint. Humans could point to fire as proof of potential, and to Prometheus' punishment as proof of limit. This mattered because explanation reduces rebellion. When people understand why a boundary exists, they are less likely to test it repeatedly. Zeus' restraint throughout this phase reinforced the perception that the system was complete. He did not seek new dominance. He did not expand control. This mattered because expansion invites resistance. Maintenance does not. By preserving rather than extending power, Zeus avoided provoking new challenges comparable to Prometheus' act. The cost of this restraint, however, was gradual psychological narrowing. When transformation is no longer imagined, aspiration contracts. Humans continued to build, create, and compete, but always within an accepted ceiling. This mattered because ceilings shape culture. Stories celebrated endurance, wisdom, and acceptance rather than breakthrough. Innovation occurred, but it did not redefine the human condition. This narrowing also affected how humans viewed the gods. Olympian deities were respected, feared, and honored, but they were no longer seen as partners in progress. They were custodians of order. This mattered because reverence replaced dialogue. The gods were above the system, not within. Italiano. Distance became part of divinity. By the end of this act, the consequences of Prometheus' defiance had fully matured. Fire remained. Knowledge advanced incrementally. Limits were accepted culturally, psychologically, and morally. Zeus's authority persisted without overt force. The system held, yet this outcome raises a final tension. Stability had been achieved by trading possibility for predictability. The world endured, but it did not fundamentally change. Prometheus had shown that change was possible. Zeus had shown that it would not be allowed again. This tension does not resolve itself here. Instead, it sets the conditions for the next stage of the narrative. With human ambition contained and divine authority stabilized, attention shifts to long-term meaning. How do gods justify rule when they no longer create progress? How do humans find purpose when limits are absolute? The next act examines how this equilibrium reshaped morality, destiny, and the way both gods and humans understood what it meant to live in a world where the most important change had already happened and could never happen again. With limits fully internalized and the Olympian order stabilized, the question that emerged was no longer how power was enforced, but how meaning was sustained. This mattered because systems that endure without offering progress must justify themselves through coherence rather than transformation. After Prometheus, The world possessed the tools for civilization, but not the freedom to redefine its foundations. Meaning had to be found within permanence. Zeus' authority adapted to this requirement by emphasizing order as value. The gods were presented less as innovators and more as guarantors of balance. This mattered because balance can be maintained indefinitely, while innovation invites disruption. The Olympian narrative increasingly framed stability itself as success. The absence of collapse became evidence of legitimacy. Human belief followed this framing. Purpose shifted from changing the world to understanding one's place within it. This mattered because meaning became interpretive rather than aspirational. People sought explanation, not escape. Rituals, myths, and philosophical inquiry focused on why things were as they were, not how they might become otherwise. The role of fate expanded within this context. Fate offered a narrative that aligned permanence with inevitability. This mattered because inevitability neutralizes dissatisfaction. If outcomes are fixed, resistance appears futile. Acceptance becomes wisdom. Zeus' system benefited from this alignment because it reduced the emotional friction that accompanies limitation. Prometheus' legacy operated quietly within this framework. His act remained the singular proof that irreversible change was possible, yet its singularity mattered more than its success. Because it could not be repeated, it functioned as boundary evidence rather than inspiration. Prometheus demonstrated capacity, not permission. This distinction preserved order while acknowledging potential. At the social level, morality adapted to these conditions. Ethical systems emphasize moderation, humility, and restraint. This mattered because excess threatened stability. The virtues most celebrated were those that minimized disruption: loyalty, endurance, and respect for tradition. Zeus' authority aligned with these values without overt enforcement. Tragedy continued to serve as a cultural mechanism for processing this reality. Stories depicted individuals confronting unavoidable loss with dignity. This mattered because tragedy reconciles suffering with meaning. It does not promise resolution. It offers comprehension. The Olympian order relied on this function to maintain psychological equilibrium among mortals. Zeus' interventions during this phase were rare and symbolic. When they occurred, they reinforced boundaries rather than opened possibilities. This mattered because symbolism carries authority without cost. A single decisive act could reaffirm limits for generations. By the end of this stage, meaning under the Olympian system had stabilized, humans lived in a world where the most transformative act had already occurred and could not be surpassed. Purpose was found in alignment, not alteration. The system endured because it asked little beyond acceptance. However, meaning built on acceptance alone carries risk. When explanation replaces aspiration entirely, vitality diminishes. The next part examines how this tension, the search for meaning within fixed limits, occasionally produced discontent, reinterpretation, and subtle forms of resistance that did not challenge power directly, but questioned its purpose. As meaning became increasingly tied to acceptance rather than transformation, tension did not disappear, it changed form. This mattered because dissatisfaction that cannot express itself through action often seeks expression through interpretation. Under the Olympian order, subtle resistance emerged not as rebellion, but as questioning, quiet, indirect, and cultural rather than political. Philosophical reflection became one outlet for this pressure. Instead of asking how to change the world, thinkers asked why it was structured as it was. This mattered because explanation can undermine authority even when action cannot. If limits are inevitable, their justification becomes critical. Zeus' system tolerated inquiry as long as it did not translate into structural defiance. Myth itself evolved to accommodate this questioning. Stories began to emphasize ambiguity in divine justice. Gods acted consistently, but not always fairly. This mattered because it acknowledged human experience without destabilizing order. The Olympian system allowed critique of outcomes while preserving the legitimacy of the structure that produced them. Ritual practice also adapted. While rituals continued to reinforce hierarchy, they increasingly focused on communal endurance rather than individual reward. This mattered because shared hardship builds cohesion. Communities bonded through collective observance, reducing the likelihood of isolated defiance. Zeus' authority was reinforced socially rather than imposed externally. Prometheus' narrative was reinterpreted again during this phase. Some traditions emphasized his foresight and sacrifice rather than his punishment. This mattered because reinterpretation allows meaning to shift without altering structure. Prometheus could be admired as a figure of compassion without encouraging imitation of his act. The system absorbed dissent by reframing it. Zeus restrained in response to these reinterpretations is significant. He did not suppress alternative readings. This mattered because suppression would have drawn attention to fragility. Allowing controlled ambiguity strengthened durability. The Olympian order proved flexible at the level of narrative, even when it remained rigid at the level of power. Human dissatisfaction therefore manifested as resignation mixed with reflection rather than revolt. This mattered because resignation stabilizes systems more effectively than fear. When people accept limits as given, they invest energy in coping rather than challenging. Zeus' governance benefited from this psychological shift. At the same time, this inward turn reduced the scope of human ambition. Innovation slowed not because it was forbidden, but because it seemed pointless. This mattered because vitality depends on perceived possibility. When possibility contracts, effort follows. By the end of this stage, the Olympian system faced a paradox. It had achieved stability through acceptance, but acceptance eroded dynamism. The world functioned, but it did not strive. Order persisted, but meaning risked stagnation. This tension did not produce collapse. It produced quiet drift. The gods remained. Humans endured. The system held, yet beneath that stability lay an unresolved question. If irreversible change had already occurred once, why must it never occur again? The next part examines how this question lingered at the edges of myth and belief, never acted upon, but never fully extinguished, and how Zeus's system managed the possibility of future disruption without reopening the door Prometheus had forced ajar. As the question of irreversible change lingered without resolution, the Olympian system responded not by tightening control, but by redefining inevitability. This mattered because inevitability neutralizes threat more effectively than force. If the future is perceived as fixed, the desire to alter it weakens. Zeus' authority increasingly relied on this perception rather than on visible power. The concept of fate expanded to support this framework. Fate was no longer only a mechanism explaining individual outcomes. It became a universal principle governing history itself. This mattered because history framed as destiny discourages innovation. Events unfold as they must, not as they could. Zeus' rule benefited from this shift because it removed agency from collective transformation. Myths reinforced this perspective by emphasizing cycles rather than breakthroughs. Human ages rose and declined. Cities flourished and fell. Heroes appeared and vanished. This mattered because repetition implies closure. When patterns repeat, novelty loses credibility. Prometheus' act stood apart precisely because it broke a pattern. The system worked to ensure it remained singular. Zeus' handling of prophecy illustrates this approach. Oracles revealed outcomes but not opportunities. This mattered because knowledge of fate does not empower action. It prepares acceptance. Prophecy replaced planning as the primary interface with the future. Humans learned what would happen, not how to change it. At the social level, this produced a culture oriented toward legacy rather than progress. Individuals sought remembrance rather than transformation. This mattered because legacy ends with memory, not with structural change. Zeus' order tolerated remembrance because it did not accumulate power. Memory fades, systems remain. Prometheus' presence within this cultural landscape continued to function as a contradiction that required containment. His act proved that fate could be disrupted once, Zeus' system responded by framing that disruption as an exception tied to a specific era. This mattered because exceptions do not invite repetition. They invite explanation. Narratives emphasized timing. Prometheus acted at a moment when boundaries were still forming. That moment had passed. This mattered because it closed the door without denying possibility outright. Change was not impossible. It was no longer timely. The system framed itself as complete. Zeus did not need to restate this explicitly. The absence of further breaches reinforced it. Silence became confirmation. Authority that no longer needs to speak is authority that expects compliance. For humans, this environment shaped ambition into introspection. Rather than asking what could be done, people asked how to live well within constraints. Ethics replaced invention. Wisdom replaced foresight. This mattered because it aligned human aspiration with Olympian stability. By the end of this phase, meaning had been successfully decoupled from transformation. The world no longer waited for a second Prometheus. It waited for understanding. The system endured by convincing its inhabitants that the most important change had already occurred and that nothing greater was meant to follow. The next part concludes this act by examining the final outcome of this strategy. Whether meaning anchored in inevitability can sustain a civilization indefinitely, or whether it inevitably thins into ritual without conviction. By the time inevitability had fully replaced transformation as the dominant framework of meaning, the Olympian system reached a state of quiet completion. Nothing dramatic ended this phase. There was no rebellion, no new catastrophe, no second theft of fire. This mattered because stability, on Tibet, rarely announces itself. It becomes invisible. The absence of rupture became the defining feature of the age. Meaning, under this system, no longer depended on expectation of change. It depended on repetition. Rituals were performed because they had always been performed. Stories were told because they explained why things were as they were. This mattered because repetition sustains coherence, even when conviction fades. Zeus' authority benefited from this continuity. It no longer needed belief in improvement, only participation. Over time, ritual risked becoming empty of urgency. When outcomes are fixed and limits absolute, practice can turn mechanical. This mattered because meaning derived from inevitability can thin into habit. The Olympian order tolerated this thinning because habit still preserves structure. Passion is unpredictable. Habit is stable. Prometheus' story, in this context, functioned as a fossil rather than a spark. It preserved the memory of transformation without activating desire for repetition. This mattered because memory without momentum reinforces boundaries. The system allowed remembrance, but not reenactment. Zeus' governance during this stage was almost entirely indirect. He did not need to intervene frequently because the framework operated on its own. Fate explained outcomes, tradition guided behavior. Mortality enforced limits. This mattered because authority had become self-sustaining. Zeus ruled a world that no longer tested him. Yet this success carried a subtle cost. When meaning rests solely on acceptance, vitality declines. Creativity persists, but it lacks urgency. Ethics remain, but they are conservative. This mattered because civilizations do not collapse only through violence. They can also thin through exhaustion of possibility. Greek myth preserves this ambiguity without resolving it. It records a world that works, but does not celebrate it as ideal. The Olympian order is durable, not inspiring. Zeus is effective, not visionary. Prometheus is punished, not redeemed. Fire burns, but it does not light a path beyond the horizon. By the end of this act, the long-term consequence of Prometheus' defiance is fully visible. Humanity gained the foundation of civilization, but lost the expectation of further foundational change. The gods retained authority, but relinquished the role of creators of progress. The world stabilized around a single, irreversible moment. This stabilization sets the conditions for the final movement of the story. With transformation exhausted and meaning routinized, the focus shifts to assessment. What does Zeus' victory truly amount to? Did the punishment of Prometheus secure justice, or merely preserve order? Did humanity gain freedom, or trade one dependency for another? The final act addresses these questions directly, not through metaphor or judgment, but through a clear accounting of what changed, what endured, and what was ultimately lost when fire crossed from the realm of gods into the hands of mortals. With the consequences of Prometheus' act fully absorbed into the structure of the world, the question that remained was not whether Zeus retained power, but where that power ended. This mattered because authority is defined not only by what it can enforce, but by what it cannot undo. Fire marked the first permanent boundary Zeus could not reverse without destroying the system he governed. From that point forward, divine authority operated within limits it had not previously acknowledged. Zeus' response to this limitation was not denial, it was redefinition. He reframed his role from controller of all outcomes to guarantor of order within fixed conditions. This mattered because it preserved legitimacy. A ruler who claims absolute power and fails loses authority. A ruler who defines power realistically retains it. Zeus adjusted the scope of his dominance without weakening its appearance. This adjustment is visible in how Zeus handled later challenges. He did not attempt to retract fundamental elements of human existence again. He did not remove language, memory, or social organization. This mattered because those elements, like fire, had become embedded. Instead, Zeus focused on regulating behavior around them. Law, fate, and consequence replaced deprivation as tools of governance. The punishment of Prometheus illustrates this shift clearly. Zeus did not punish the outcome of the theft, he punished the act itself. This mattered because it acknowledged that results could stand while transgression could still be condemned. Authority adapted to irreversible change by separating outcome from judgment. This separation became a defining feature of Olympian rule. Humans could build, innovate, and expand within bounds, but they remained accountable for how they used those capacities. Zeus did not need to prevent progress. He needed to frame responsibility. The system relied on consequence rather than prohibition. At the divine level, this acknowledgement of limit influenced how Zeus interacted with other gods. Disputes were managed through arbitration rather than force. This mattered because force risked destabilization. Arbitration preserved hierarchy while respecting constraint. Zeus' authority became judicial rather than absolute. Fate reinforced this framework by absorbing responsibility for outcomes beyond control. When tragedy occurred, Zeus could enforce justice without being blamed for inevitability. This mattered because it protected authority from erosion. Power endured because it no longer promised total control. From a structural perspective, Prometheus' act forced Zeus into a more sustainable form of rule. Absolute power collapses when it fails. Limited power persists when it adapts. This mattered because Zeus' reign outlasted all previous regimes, precisely because it accepted constraint. By the end of this stage, the Olympian system operated with a clear internal logic. Some things could be done, some things could not be undone. Authority existed to manage consequences, not to rewrite reality. This distinction stabilized the cosmos without reopening the possibility of another foundational breach. The next part examines how this recognition of limit reshapes Zeus' self-image and long-term strategy, how ruling within constraint altered not only divine governance, but the meaning of sovereignty itself. Once Zeus had accepted that certain outcomes could not be reversed, sovereignty itself required reinterpretation. This mattered because earlier divine regimes defined power as the ability to impose or remove conditions at will. After Prometheus, that definition no longer held. Fire remained in human hands, and its consequences continued to unfold independently of Olympus. Zeus's authority survived by changing what it meant to rule. Ruling within limits required predictability. Zeus increasingly emphasized law, oath, and precedent as stabilizing forces. This mattered because rules reduce uncertainty without requiring constant intervention. Oaths bound gods and mortals alike, and breaking them carried consequences that did not depend on Zeus' immediate action. Authority became embedded in structure rather than presence. This shift is visible in Zeus' role as guarantor of justice. He did not eliminate injustice, but he defined its boundaries. This mattered because justice became procedural. Disputes were weighed, not erased. Punishment was calibrated, not absolute. Zeus' judges reinforced hierarchy while acknowledging constraint. At the same time, Zeus curtailed the scope of divine experimentation. Gods retained individuality, but their actions increasingly aligned with established domains. This mattered because cross-domain interference risked creating new, irreversible effects. Prometheus had crossed domains foresight into execution and altered humanity permanently. Zeus prevented repetition by reinforcing separation. Human autonomy continued to grow within these parameters. Cities developed laws, economies, and customs that operated independently of daily, divine oversight. This mattered because decentralization reduced pressure on Olympus. Humans governed themselves within a framework whose outer limits were already set. Zeus' authority became background infrastructure rather than foreground command. Fate played a critical role in maintaining this balance. By assigning outcomes to inevitability, fate shielded Zeus from the expectation of omnipotence. This mattered because expectation erodes authority when unmet. Fate absorbed blame and uncertainty, allowing Zeus to remain the enforcer of order without being the author of every event. Prometheus' punishment remained central to this arrangement. Its constancy signaled that while outcomes could persist, defiance was not cost-free. This mattered because it discouraged attempts to test limits directly. The system allowed adaptation, not challenge. Over time, Zeus' governance resembled stewardship more than domination. He preserved conditions rather than dictating change. This mattered because stewardship is compatible with permanence. Dominance invites resistance. Stewardship invites compliance. This evolution did not weaken Zeus' position among the gods. It strengthened it. Other Olympians operated within the same constraints, reducing rivalry. Authority was maintained through consensus around limits, rather than fear of overthrow. BDI's Zeus had transformed a moment of vulnerability into a stable model of rule. The theft of fire exposed a boundary. Zeus's response institutionalized it. Power endured, not by denying reality, but by integrating constraint into governance. The next part examines the final implication of this transformation. How a ruler defined by limits reshaped divine hierarchy, and why Zeus, except on Zoph, constraint became the foundation of his long reign rather than its weakness. As Zeus' authority settled into a model defined by limits, the divine hierarchy itself adjusted to reflect that reality. This mattered because hierarchy is only stable when its rules are understood and accepted by those within it. Earlier divine orders collapsed when power concentrated without constraint. Under Zeus, hierarchy endured because boundaries applied upward as well as downward. Among the Olympians, Zeus' acceptance of constraint altered how loyalty functioned. Gods no longer feared arbitrary suppression in the same way Titans once had. Instead, they operated within defined domains that were rarely violated. This mattered because predictability reduces conflict. When boundaries are respected, rivalry becomes manageable rather than existential. This shift is evident in how disputes among gods were resolved. Zeus acted less as an enforcer through force, and more as an arbiter through judgment. This mattered because arbitration preserved structure without escalating tension. Conflicts could be settled without threatening the stability of the entire system. Authority became judicial rather than coercive. The memory of Prometheus remained relevant at this level as well. His punishment did not only warn against defiance, it clarified the scope of acceptable action. Gods learned that crossing certain boundaries, especially those involving irreversible change, would be met with containment rather than annihilation. This mattered because containment preserves hierarchy while avoiding the chaos of total elimination. Zeus' position at the top of this hierarchy depended on restraint. He demonstrated power by not exercising it unnecessarily. This mattered because restraint signals confidence. A ruler who intervenes constantly reveals insecurity. Zeus' selective intervention reinforced the perception that the system was stable and complete. Fate reinforced this perception by placing even Zeus within a broader framework. While Zeus enforced fate, he did not override it freely. This mattered because it placed a ceiling on authority that applied universally. Gods accepted hierarchy not only because Zeus ruled, but because no one could escape the structure governing outcomes. For mortals observing this divine order, the message was consistent. Power endured through alignment with limits, not through domination. This mattered because human governance mirrored divine precedent. Kings emphasized law, continuity, and restraint over conquest. Authority became institutional rather than personal. At the same time, the system discouraged innovation at the highest level. When hierarchy stabilizes, transformation becomes risky. This mattered because the Olympian order traded adaptability for durability. Zeus' reign lasted, but it did not evolve significantly after this point. Prometheus' defiance remained the last moment when hierarchy was fundamentally altered from below. No god or mortal repeated that act. This mattered because the system had learned. The cost of crossing foundational boundaries was too high, and the benefit too limited. By the end of this phase, Zeus' authority rested on a paradox. He ruled because he accepted that he could not rule everything. Constraint became legitimacy. Limits became strength. The final part of this act examines whether this model of restrained and bounded represented the ultimate solution to the cycle of overthrow, or whether it simply postponed a reckoning that myth never fully resolves. By the end of this phase, Zeus' authority had reached its most refined form. It was no longer defined by expansion, conquest, or constant demonstration of strength. It was defined by equilibrium. This mattered because equilibrium is harder to challenge than domination. A system that balances itself does not provoke the same resistance as one that imposes change aggressively. Zeus' acceptance of limits resolved the primary instability that destroyed earlier divine regimes. Uranus and Cronus attempted to eliminate threats. Entirely, their fear produced rebellion. Zeus chose containment, distribution, and structural constraint. This mattered because the removal of absolute control prevented the conditions that made overthrow inevitable. The cycle did not end through force. It ended through redesign. Prometheus' defiance functioned as the catalyst for this redesign. Without it, Zeus might never have confronted the boundary of his own power. This mattered because authority often reveals its limits only under pressure. Fire exposed a point beyond which reversal was impossible. Zeus' response absorbing change, rather than negating it, became the foundation of long-term rule. This foundation reshaped how power was perceived across the cosmos. Authority no longer promised transformation. It promised continuity. This mattered because continuity can be maintained indefinitely, while transformation demands constant justification. Zeus' reign endured because it asked less of the future than earlier regimes had. However, this endurance came with a trade-off. A system optimized for stability resists renewal. Innovation becomes marginal. Structural change becomes unthinkable. This mattered because the Olympian order solved the problem of collapse by limiting the horizon of possibility. The world functioned, but it no longer evolved in fundamental ways. For gods, this meant security at the cost of creative freedom. Roles hardened, domains stabilized, conflict diminished, but so did dynamism. This mattered because divine identity became administrative rather than transformative. The gods ruled processes rather than shaping outcomes. For humans, the cost was subtler, but enduring. Fire enabled civilization, but the expectation of further foundational change disappeared. Prometheus had shown that such change was possible. Zeus ensured it would not happen again. This mattered because possibility shapes ambition. When possibility near us, aspiration follows. Greek myth preserves this tension without resolving it. Zeus is neither condemned nor celebrated absolutely. He's recorded that his system works. It holds, but it does not inspire. Prometheus is neither redeemed nor erased. He remains bound, a permanent reminder that the limits of power were discovered, not chosen. By accepting constraint, Zeus secured the longest reign in mythic history. He did not eliminate the cycle of overthrow by defeating it. He neutralized it by removing the conditions that fed it. This achievement defines his legacy more than any battle or decree. As this act closes, the story reaches its final transition. With authority stabilized, limits accepted, and irreversible change contained, only one question remains. What does such a world ultimately amount to? The final act turns to that question directly. It evaluates the long-term outcome of Prometheus' defiance and Zeus' response to Dante's mythic drama, but as a final accounting of what humanity gained, what it lost, and what kind of order emerged when power learned where it must stop. With Zeus, authority stabilized, and the boundaries of power clearly defined. The long-term effects of Prometheus' defiance can be assessed from a human perspective. This mattered because the conflict was never only about gods. It reshaped the human condition in ways that persisted long after divine tensions settled. Fire was not merely a tool. It restructured what it meant to live as a mortal within an ordered cosmos. The most visible gain was capability. Fire enabled humans to survive environments that would otherwise be lethal. Cooking improved nutrition and reduced disease. Metalworking allowed durable tools, weapons, and infrastructure. Settlements became permanent rather than temporary. This mattered because it shifted humanity from reactive survival to planned existence. Humans could now anticipate needs and shape surroundings deliberately. However, this capability introduced dependency of a different kind. Humans became dependent on systems they created. Agriculture required labor cycles. Cities required defense. Technology required maintenance. This mattered because independence from the gods did not produce freedom from constraint. It replaced external dependence with internal obligation. Fire also accelerated inequality. Those who controlled tools, land, and resources gained power over others. This mattered because hierarchy emerged organically within human society. Zeus did not impose this structure. Humans generated it themselves. Authority shifted downward, but conflict followed. From a divine perspective, this outcome was acceptable. Human inequality limited unity. Fragmented societies were less likely to challenge Olympian order collectively. This mattered because Zeus' system benefited indirectly from internal human division. The gift of fire produced civilization, but it also produced rivalry. Another gain was continuity. Fire allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations. Skills could be taught, refined, and preserved. This mattered because memory became a human asset. Unlike earlier eras, progress did not reset completely with each generation. Civilization became cumulative. Yet this accumulation intensified loss. When societies failed, they failed catastrophically. Collapse meant famine, displacement, and mass death. This mattered because fire amplified both success and failure. Human history became higher risk. Zeus' governance tolerated this volatility because it occurred within human systems, not the cosmic structure. Prometheus' punishment remained the counterweight to these gains. Humanity prospered, but the benefactors suffered endlessly. This mattered because it prevented a clean moral victory. Fire was not framed as liberation without cost. The system ensured that improvement carried a visible price. Over time, humans internalized this balance. Advancement was possible, but never free. Every benefit implied burden. This mattered because it shaped ethics. Prudence, restraint, and respect for limits became survival traits rather than moral ideals. By the end of this phase, humanity occupied a new but constrained position. Humans were capable without being sovereign. They could build without transcending mortality. They could understand the world without controlling it fully. Fire elevated human existence, but it did not dissolve the hierarchy above it. The next part examines the losses that accompanied these gains more directly, not in terms of material hardship, but in terms of possibility. What forms of freedom, imagination, and future were quietly foreclosed once Prometheus' singular act became the last of its kind. Alongside the tangible gains brought by fire, humanity experienced losses that were less visible but equally structural. These losses did not arrive as sudden disasters. They emerged gradually as possibilities narrowed and expectations adjusted. This mattered because what is slowly surrendered often goes unnoticed until it can no longer be recovered. One of the most significant losses was collective potential. Before Prometheus' act, humanity existed in a state of dependency that limited action but did not define limits clearly. After fire, the limits became explicit. Humans learned what could be done and, more importantly, what could not be done again. This mattered because possibility shapes ambition. Once the horizon is fixed, aspiration recalibrates downward. Fire did not only enable creation, it defined a ceiling. Humanity received a foundational tool, but not an open path. This mattered because future transformation was framed as incremental rather than structural. Humans could improve methods, but not conditions. The idea that the human state itself might be fundamentally altered disappeared from expectation. Another loss involved direct relationship with the divine. As humans became more capable, the gods became more distant. This mattered because intimacy declined. Earlier myths describe frequent interaction, negotiation, and confrontation between mortals and gods. After Prometheus, interaction became formalized through ritual and interpretation. Dialogue became ceremony. Presence became symbol. This distance reduced volatility, but it also reduced agency. Humans could no longer appeal directly to alter circumstances. They could only seek understanding or endure. This mattered because it changed the emotional texture of belief. Faith became stabilizing rather than transformative. Fire also introduced a new relationship with time. Technological progress encouraged planning, accumulation, and projection into the future. This mattered because loss became heavier. When a society that has invested deeply collapses, the cost is higher. Earlier losses were local. Later losses were systemic. Fire made history more fragile, even as it made it cumulative. Mortality itself became more pronounced under these conditions. As humans built lasting structures, death appeared more disruptive. This mattered because attachment increased. Fire extended life's capacity, but did not extend life indefinitely. The contrast sharpened awareness of Prometheus' punishment reinforced this awareness. His immortality made his suffering endless. Human mortality made suffering temporary, but repetitive across generations. This mattered because it highlighted asymmetry. Humans could progress, but not escape death. Prometheus could foresee outcomes, but not end his pain. Both conditions reinforced limit. Another subtle loss was imagination of alternatives. When the most transformative act is singular and unrepeated, it becomes anomaly rather than precedent. This mattered because culture learned to explain rather than envision. Myths justified the world as it was, instead of imagining how it might become. Acceptance replaced experimentation. By the end of this phase, humanity lived in a world that was richer, more complex, and more constrained than before. Fire delivered capacity, but it also finalized structure. Progress occurred within a corridor that could not widen. The next part examines how humanity adapted psychologically to this trade-off, how people learned to value endurance over change, meaning over possibility, and how that adaptation shaped the long arc of human identity under Olympian rule. Faced with gains that carried permanent limits, humanity adapted not by resisting the structure of the world, but by reshaping identity within it. This mattered because identity determines how limits are experienced. When limits are perceived as unjust, they provoke rebellion. When they are perceived as inherent, they shape character. Under the Olympian order, human identity shifted toward endurance, interpretation, and acceptance as core traits. This adaptation is visible in how success was redefined. Achievement was no longer measured by transformation of conditions, but by conduct within them. This mattered because excellence became ethical rather than structural. To live well did not mean to change the world, but to act with restraint, honor, and awareness of consequence. Greek myth increasingly emphasized these qualities in its portrayal of exemplary figures. Heroism evolved accordingly. Earlier heroic figures confront chaos directly. Later, heroes confront inevitability. This mattered because the nature of struggle changed. The challenge was no longer to overcome fate, but to meet it without collapse. Courage became endurance. Wisdom became knowing when action could not alter outcome. Social memory reinforced this identity shift. Stories preserved examples of those who accepted limits and those who violated them. This mattered because memory regulates behavior across generations. Prometheus' story functioned here as a boundary marker rather than a model. He was remembered not as a path to follow, but as the event that clarified the boundary. Religion played a stabilizing role in this adaptation. Worship focused on alignment rather than petition. Humans sought favor in the sense of balance, not exception. This mattered because expectation shapes experience. When miracles are not anticipated, their absence does not undermine belief. The Olympian order benefited from this recalibration. At the same time, philosophy emerged as a parallel response. When transformation is foreclosed, understanding becomes a substitute. This mattered because inquiry allows engagement without disruption. Humans examined justice, fate, and virtue not to change divine order, but to situate themselves within it. Thought replaced rebellion. This inward turn altered emotional life. Desire narrowed. Hope became modest. Fear became familiar. This mattered because emotional stability supports systemic stability. Zeus' authority did not require enthusiasm. It required accommodation. Human psychology adapted accordingly. However, adaptation carried a cost. When identity is built around acceptance, imagination weakens. This mattered because imagination is the engine of change. Under the Olympian system, imagination survived in art and myth, but not an expectation of reality. Stories explored possibility, but life remained bounded. Prometheus' punishment remained a constant reminder of this distinction. His foresight imagined change. His action enacted it once. His suffering marked the end of that possibility. This mattered because it anchored identity in finality. Humans lived after the last foundational change. By the end of this stage, humanity had become resilient rather than aspirational. Life was navigable, meaningful, and constrained. The Olympian order did not crush human spirits. It shaped Italiano. The final part of this act examines whether this reshaped identity represented maturity or resignation, whether living well within limits constituted fulfillment, or whether something essential was quietly lost when Prometheus' defiance became the last act of its kind. By the end of this long adjustment, humanity had settled into a condition that was neither triumphant nor defeated. It was functional. This mattered because functionality, not freedom, became the measure of success under the Olympian order. Humans could survive, build, remember, and transmit knowledge across generations. At the same time, they could not reconfigure the foundations of their existence. Prometheus' act remained the last moment when that seemed possible. From a practical standpoint, this outcome delivered stability. Civilizations rose within known limits. Collapse occurred, but it was internal, rather than cosmic. This mattered because the Olympian system no longer needed to intervene to correct human excess. Human societies generated their own constraints through conflict, scarcity, and mortality. Zeus' authority remained intact precisely because it was not tested at the foundational level. Yet this stability came with an unmistakable narrowing of horizon. Once it became clear that no further Promethean act would occur, ambition recalibrated. Humans no longer imagined a future fundamentally different from the past. They imagined better versions of the same conditions. This mattered because progress became iterative rather than transformative. Improvement replaced change. This shift altered how loss was processed. Earlier eras treated loss as temporary disruption. Later eras treated it as permanent feature. This mattered because grief became structural. Death, failure, and collapse were not anomalies to be corrected. They were conditions to be endured. Human resilience deepened, but hope became restrained. Prometheus' punishment anchored this understanding. His endless suffering stood in contrast to human mortality. Humans suffered briefly, repeatedly, and then disappeared. Prometheus suffered continuously and could not escape. This mattered because it reinforced asymmetry. Humans were allowed progress within life. Prometheus bore the cost across eternity. The system balanced benefit and burden across different forms of existence. Over time, this balance produced a quiet acceptance of limitation as wisdom. Those who sought too much were remembered as warnings. Those who endured were remembered as models. This mattered because cultural memory guides behavior more effectively than force. Zeus' authority was preserved through narrative rather than threat. At the same time, something irretrievable was lost. The belief that humanity might someday redefine its place in the cosmos faded. This mattered because belief precedes action. Without belief, possibility contracts. The Olympian order did not forbid imagination, but it rendered it symbolic rather than practical. By the close of this act, the full trade-off is visible. Humanity gained civilization, continuity, and relative autonomy. Humanity lost the expectation of further foundational change. Zeus gained enduring authority by accepting limits. Prometheus lost freedom by proving those limits existed. This outcome is not framed in Greek myth as justice or injustice. It is framed as result. The world that followed Prometheus works. It holds it persis, but it does not transcend itself. The final act moves from consequence to conclusion. It assesses, without symbolism or moral sermon, what this arrangement ultimately amounts to. Was Prometheus' defiance worth its cost? Did Zeus respond secure order or foreclose possibility? And what kind of world remains when the last irreversible change has already happened? At this final stage, the story of Prometheus and Zeus can be evaluated not as isolated myth, but as a completed system of cause and consequence. This matters because Greek mythology does not argue its conclusions. It records outcomes. The theft of fire, the punishment of Prometheus, and the adaptation of Olympian rule form a closed loop that defines how power, change, and limitation operate together. Prometheus' actions succeeded in the narrowest and most consequential sense. Fire entered human hands permanently. Civilization became possible. Humanity gained tools, continuity, and the capacity to shape its environment beyond immediate survival. This mattered because no later act in Greek myth achieved a comparable structural shift in the human condition. Fire was the last foundational gift. At the same time, the cost of that success was neither symbolic nor temporary. Prometheus' punishment was unending. Humanity's condition became permanently bounded. Zeus did not retaliate by reversing the gain. He responded by ensuring that it would never be surpassed. This mattered because power adapted rather than collapsed. The Olympian order absorbed irreversible change and then closed the path that allowed it. From Zeus's perspective, this response was effective. Authority endured. The cycle of overthrow that destroyed earlier regimes was neutralized. Zeus ruled longer than Uranus and Cronus because he accepted constraint and built governance around it. This mattered because stability, not dominance, became the defining metric of success. However, effectiveness does not equal completeness. The Olympian system solved the problem of collapse, but it did not resolve the tension between power and possibility. Humanity was allowed to improve within limits, but not to redefine those limits. This mattered because progress without transformation produces endurance, not fulfillment. Greek myth does not present Prometheus as a simple hero or Zeus as a simple tyrant. It presents them as functions within a system. Prometheus represents the capacity for irreversible change. Zeus represents the capacity to contain that change without destroying the system. Neither fully wins. Neither fully loses. The world that emerges from this conflict is coherent and durable. Humans live, build, suffer, and die within a stable order. The gods rule without constant intervention. Fate explains what cannot be changed. This mattered because explanation replaced expectation. The future became predictable in structure, even if not in detail. What is absent from the record is a second Prometheus. No waiter figure repeats the act. This absence is not accidental. It is the result of a system redesigned to prevent repetition. The cost of defiance became too high. The benefit became too limited. Possibility narrowed. At this point, the assessment becomes unavoidable. Prometheus' defiance expanded the human condition, but finalized its boundaries. Zeus's response preserved order, but foreclosed further foundational change. Humanity gained civilization and lost the expectation of transcendence. The final part of this act completes that assessment by addressing one remaining question. When irreversible change is possible only once, what does it ultimately mean to succeed? When irreversible change occurs only once, success must be measured differently. This mattered because Greek mythology evaluates outcomes by durability, not by aspiration. Prometheus achieved the only foundational shift permitted to humanity. Zeus ensured that shift did not multiply. The world that followed reflects that balance. Civilization exists, it persists, but it does not remake itself. From a human perspective, this outcome is mixed. Fire delivered the means to survive, organize, and remember. It enabled continuity across generations. This mattered because continuity is the prerequisite for culture. Without fire, there is no accumulation of skill, no stable society, no history in the human sense. Prometheus' act therefore succeeded in establishing the conditions for everything that followed. Yet those same conditions fixed the ceiling. Humanity could refine tools, laws, and customs, but not redefine the structure of existence. Mortality remained. Suffering remained. Dependence shifted from gods to systems, but it did not disappear. This mattered because freedom increased in scope, but not in kind. Humans gained agency within the world, not over it. From Zeus's perspective, the response was decisive and proportionate. He did not erase the gain. He preserved order by preventing repetition. This mattered because systems collapse when exceptional acts become precedents. Zeus allowed the exception to stand while ensuring it remained singular. Authority endured because it learned where it must stop. The absence of further Promethean acts is the strongest evidence of this success. No later myth records a comparable breach. Knowledge advances, but foundational change does not recur. This mattered because the system internalized the lesson. Possibility narrowed not through prohibition alone, but through expectation. When people no longer believe a path exists, they stop searching for it. Greek myth does not frame this as tragedy or triumph. It frames it as settlement. The conflict resolves into a world that works. Gods rule within limits. Humans live within limits. Fate explains what cannot be altered. Meaning is derived from conduct rather than transformation. In this settled world, Prometheus remains bound and visible, Zeus remains in power and distant. Fire burns in every hearth. None of these facts change. This mattered because permanence, not progress, becomes the defining feature of the age. The system holds because it no longer demands novelty. What was ultimately lost is not capacity, but expectation. The belief that humanity might someday alter the foundations of its existence fades. In its place emerges resilience, interpretation, and endurance. This is not presented as failure. It is presented as outcome. What was gained is civilization itself, fragile, unequal, and bounded, but real. Humanity becomes capable of history. Zeus becomes capable of long rule. The world becomes stable enough to persist. Greek mythology ends this story without reversal, redemption, or renewal. It records a balance struck once and maintained thereafter. Prometheus' defiance mattered because it revealed what could change. Zeus's response mattered because it revealed what would not. That is the final accounting, a world where the most important change has already happened and where everything that follows exists in its shadow. Before you go, if you found this analysis useful, consider liking the video and subscribing for more long-form mythological documentaries. In the comments, tell us where you are watching from, what time it is there right now, and whether you think Prometheus ultimately helped humanity or limited it by ending the possibility of further change. Thank you for listening. Until the end.